Thank you very much, David, for the invitation, and thank you all for being here for the second seminar of the first cycle of 2025. I hope you have a lovely Christmas break. So the article, the research I'm going to present to you today is a joint work with Dario Guarascio, that is professor at University La Sapienza of Rome, and Maria Enrica Virgillito, that is professor in economics at Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna in Pisa. And so, as I said, the title is Neglected Origins of Inequality, Hierarchical Power and Care. And no, it's not going. No, it's okay. So, before starting, let me introduce this topic with the motivation that inspired us. Why we wanted to look at wage inequality focusing on power and care, essentially because these two issues are at the center, if you want, a recent trend in wage inequality, and which are two, according to us, of the main issues that we should look at when we think and when we discuss wage inequality. The first one is synthesized also by this picture that is taken from a protest in a strike in England during the COVID, where nurses and doctors were asking for higher pay. And so it reflects the structural under-evaluation and underestimation of the role of essential care jobs, so whether in the health sector or also in the service and personal sector. And the second main trend that we wanted to look at, do you see clearly or do we need to turn off the lights? It's fine, okay. The second main trend we wanted to look at is the soaring and exacerbating inequality at the top. When we look at occupation and macro-occupational groups, we know that the wage gap ratio between the wage of an executive worker, a manager, and the wage of a blue-collar worker or a white-collar worker is increasing a lot, no? So that the wage of manager is much higher. Here is only 10 times, because here these are average wage for dependent worker, but then if we consider also workers that are not considered dependent but they have the role of managers, then of course this gap is even higher, okay? So these are the two main trends we wanted to look at. On the one hand, the under-evaluation of care in terms of wages, pay, but also working condition, job contract, and on the other hand, the soaring inequality between the top of the distribution and the bottom, or even the medium part of the distribution, as is the case of white-collar workers. Then the question is how the literature has treated and studied the wage inequality, especially when we look at the mainstream approach. If we want to give, let's say, a very synthetic and rough description of the approach that has been used in the mainstream economic theory of wage inequality, we could say that the main theoretical building block is the concept of human capital. Have you heard of this concept, I think, in your studies? Yes, a lot. So the main idea behind the human capital theory is that essentially wage are a remuneration of an investment that has been done, that is essentially the investment in years of education and also in years of experience in the labor market, no? So the idea is that essentially wages are the positive returns, like returns of an investment, in this case that depends on education, labor experience, and tenure, okay? Who were the main proponents, the first scholars that formulated this theory of human capital? We can certainly identify Becker and Mintzer, that were two very important economists that introduced this concept of human capital as a causal explanation of wage and wage inequality. Have you heard of the Mintzer equation? Not my student, because they know. Yes? No? Okay, the Mintzer equation is a very simple, if you want, empirical toolkit that is still nowadays widely used as a baseline model in labor economics to study the determinants of wages. Okay, we can have a look at it here. Let me say that Jacob Mintzer, in his, I'm not sure, maybe it was his doctoral thesis, but I'm not sure, in 1974 published this book, Schooling, Experience and Earnings, where for the first time he was trying to connect the three elements: American earnings, education, schooling, and experience in the labor market. And he formulated this, essentially this equation, this quantitative relation between the variable of interest, according to which the log of wages the wage of an individual can be explained by the minimum wage in this case, plus three main elements: the years of schooling that represent the educational attainment of a worker, the experience, and the experience squared. Have you have an idea why here we have experience squared? Not my student, or maybe yes, if they want. Yes. It will not. It will. Is not. He's saying that the impact is not linear in the sense that the impact of 1 year more of education will not be the same on wages if you are at the beginning of your career or later at the end of your career. Okay. So this is let's say, is a baseline model where you already introduces an element of non-linearity, of complexity, if you want. Okay. But this is a very simple theoretical approach that really treats education as an investment. So wages are the return of an investment. Okay. Why is it so important to look at, to know the Mincer equation? Because this approach is still at the basis of the contemporary theory of wage inequality, even if with much more sophisticated models and empirical setting. We can say that, indeed, if we look now at the theory that is adopted in labor economics to study wage determinants, the main principle of the Mincer equation, that is the idea that wages are a market remuneration of an asset, the education, is still there, even if the factors that we are considering now are quite different. Let me explain you better what I mean for this. Have you heard of the skill bias technical change theory? In some sense, you can consider this theory as a continuation, as an expansion of the Mincer theory. Because what the skill bias technical change theory tells us? It tells us that the skill premia that we observe for certain type of jobs, for certain type of worker, is essentially related to their educational attainment. But since the American economy was characterized by a very strong mismatch between the demand of college workers and the availability of college workers, this can explain why the wages of college workers increased a lot. Okay, so as you see, there is an individual attribute, in this case the education level, and a market dynamics, the mismatch between labor and supply. And this is the skill bias technical change that in some sense updated the Mincer approach, taking into account the evolution of the labor market in US. Okay. Then things became more complicated. At the end of 80s, with the introduction and the expansion of ICT technologies and the expansion of computer and automated technologies, this skill premium was less relevant in explaining wage differences, okay, in the labor market dynamics. And that's why an enrichment, a change, let's say, a modification of the skill bias technical change theory pushed to the introduction of the so-called task bias technological change theory. Do you know this theory as well? Maybe this, but this you have heard of even in the debate, because it's something that is quite mainstream and dominant in the debate. So the main idea now is that we do not focus anymore on skills, because skills are not enough to explain the attributes of workers and jobs, but we move to jobs, okay? So the focus now is not the individual level of educational attainment, but is the job. And what are jobs from a mainstream perspective, according to you? From a labor mainstream approach, how we can define jobs? Sorry? Yeah, labor is a factor of production, but the job activity can be seen as a bundle of skills and tasks, okay? You need some skills to perform some tasks, and you have to perform some tasks to use your skills, okay? So the idea is that jobs are defined as a bundle of skills and tasks. So looking only at tasks just tell us a part of the story, but not all the story. We need to look at tasks. We need to look at the type of activities that workers do during their everyday work, okay? And the idea is then that we need to relate the type of tasks performed by workers with the role of technology, with the idea that some technologies can substitute, can replace workers. Which type of activity can be replaced by computer in this approach, according to you? Activity that are manual that are cognitive, which type of activity, if you look at the ICT during 90s, could be replaced by computers? Yes? What can you? Yes, so we could say repetitive cognitive activities that can be easily traduced in codified tasks, okay? Tasks that then can be translated in code, in rules that can be performed by computers. So the idea is that once we look at tasks, we identify tasks that are repetitive, characterized by high degree of repetitiveness, a cognitive repetitiveness that can be translated in a codified setting. In this case, this type of activities can be performed by computers and technology. And these type of activities are mainly performed by which type of workers? Manual workers, blue-collar workers, white-collar workers. And so there is the theory, let's say, of job polarization that is really coming from this approach, according to which we see that in advanced economies we have an increase of low-skilled jobs because they are manual jobs, they cannot be replaced by computers, technologies, and high-skilled jobs like manager and so on and so forth, they cannot be replaced. But in the middle, or white-collar jobs that are characterized by high degree of repetitiveness can be replaced by, let's say, roughly by technologies. And this is the idea, let's say, very roughly explain a very synthetic way of the task-based approach, okay? The tasks are the crucial element to look at if we want to understand the dynamics of the labor market evolution, both in terms of wages and both in terms of level of employment. Okay? And still nowadays, despite the same authors that have introduced this approach have refined their perspective, like for instance author, that is a very important labor economist, they are still strictly referring to this main idea of a market-based approach to wages. So here I quote one sentence from author, where in a paper of 2022, when he also advances some criticism with respect to the routine task approach, but where at the end, if you want, he confirms the same theoretical approach. What is telling us author? It is telling us the following. What workers earn in a market economy depends substantially, though not exclusively, on their productivity. That is, the value they produce through their labor. Their productivity depends in turn on two things. First, their capabilities, concretely the tasks they can accomplish, and second, their scarcity. So do you see that in this definition of productivity, we can find the idea, if you implicit idea of skills and tasks in, as explained in the routine bias approach? Because capabilities, if you want, in the way author is defining them, are the combination of skills and tasks, okay? Education and capability of performing some task. And the scarcity, clearly, is thinking of the scarcity of workers' capabilities, both in terms of availability of workers, but also in terms of potential substitution by technologies, okay? So this is, if you want, very quickly, have a synthesis, a summary of the mainstream approach to wage inequality. But then there are some problems with these approaches, okay, which are, according to you, some of the points we are not taking into account with this perspective. Even, I mean, empirical facts that we observe in the economy that, according to you, cannot be explained by this theory. Yes? Yes, absolutely. So the role of institutions, the role of actor, and the relevance of the bargaining power and conflict among actors. Yes. And also something else? Yes. Okay, so also the heterogeneity across countries and stages of development, this is also another element. And even another element, still another factor. Yes. Yes, exactly. Also the dimension of race and gender gap that cannot be explained within this framework, because not all the race and gender wage gap can be explained according to a skill and task. You wanted to add something? It was this point. Exactly. So you have touched the point that I wanted also to underline. This idea of the gender race wage gap and the role of institutions, and how institutional change and institutional setting can also shape the way wages are determined, and also how the wage inequality takes place in a context or in another. How does this approach integrate and take into account these, if you want, empirical contradictions, essentially expanding the number of individual factors that you need to consider? For instance, even the Nobel Prize, Claudia Goldin, that is an economist that has produced a lot of interesting contribution on gender inequality, also try to find as explanation of gender wage gap also dynamics of conflict between family choice and career choice, as individual aspiration, and so on and so forth, without questioning the very nature of the wage setting system. There are also other two main criticisms that we can move to this mainstream approach of wage inequality that are coming from the Marxian perspective and the feminist perspective. Let's say that according to the Marxian perspective, we could say that one of the main problems of this approach is the structural neglection of the conflict that characterizes the relation between labor and power, and the role of class division within society, and how the presence of class division can also shape and contribute to the maintenance of a wage unequal system, okay? So, of course, from a Marxian perspective, the dimension of the concept of productivity does not have the same sense that the one that we discussed before, because the productivity of worker is something that you actually need to interpret with respect to the amount of value that is extracted by the capitalist class with respect to the worker that is producing value, okay? Then there is also a feminist critique, if you want, to this approach that touches another point, which is also very relevant, that is the role of care, the role of social reproduction structure, the role of social reproduction. What is social reproduction? Social reproduction is a term, a concept that we can use to identify all the activities that are needed in order to reproduce the labor force, okay? All the caring activities that are needed, that can be activities that need to aim at satisfying physical needs, health needs, but also mental, cognitive, and relational needs. All these needs are crucial to ensure the reproduction of society, and are crucial also, if you want, in a capitalist organization to ensure that the labor force is available and able to perform the work, okay? So, according to a feminist approach, we need to integrate the social reproduction structure in the analysis of wages, because the social reproduction influences and affects not only the decision of women that are the one that perform most of care activities, but also can affect the way care activities are valued on the market. Because care jobs, care activities can be performed on the market, they can be paid, usually underpaid, but can also be performed at home, mainly by women, okay? Doubts until now? It's fine, okay. So, this is the goal of this paper is essentially to integrate these two dimensions, the dimension of care within our analysis of wage inequality, and also the dimension of conflict between classes, how introducing this concept of hierarchical power as an individual attribute that we need to take into account when we look at wages. How do we proceed in order to, let's say, to meet this ambitious goal? First of all, data. Data are crucial in this type of analysis because are really the main sources through which you can inspect and investigate this type of topic. We use two types of data. The ECP, this research is on Italian data, so is on the Italian economy. The first database is the ECP, Indagine Campionaria delle Professioni. This is a survey that, let's say, replicates the ONET survey, US survey. you might know the ONET survey because it's a very rich and detailed occupational database on the American structure that tells you a lot of information about job activities, working condition, skills, and so on and so forth. And is widely used by economists and sociologists to study the characteristic of labor, okay, the features of labor. And in Italy, they performed a very similar survey that essentially replicates the ONET one. And then here we have information on occupations. Occupation at the 5-digit level. Do you know what do we mean when we think a digit level? Essentially, it's a degree of aggregation and disaggregation. We move from ISCO class, legislator, managers, intellectuals, scientific workers, so big groups, big occupational groups, and we move down to a very disaggregated level of analysis that can be the teacher of high school and so on and so forth, okay? So it's a way to identify, to label occupations from a high level of aggregation to a high level of disaggregation. Of course, the higher the digit, the more the level of disaggregation. So the more we are, the closer we are to the real job that we observe in reality. So in this survey, we have a detailed and highly disaggregated data, meaning that we have a lot of information on real jobs, okay? And then we have the Italian labor force survey. That is a survey like the labor survey that provides information about wages, socio-demographic characteristics, sectors, so on and so forth, geographical area, type of employment contract, and so on. And we match the two databases. So what we want to do, as I said, is to proxy and to identify these two attributes, care and power. How can we do this? We essentially elaborate an indicator of power that I will explain you in a moment, and we are also able, through the use of DCP, to identify care jobs according to the content of the occupation, to the main content, to the main activity that is performed by each occupation. Then, once we have constructed these indicators, we make our empirical analysis. First, we perform a Minserian wage equation, standard Minserian wage equation, where step by step we add variable to, let's say, expand the analysis of wages, and then we move to a quantile regression analysis that, according to us, is more adapted to account for the unequal impact of our variable along the wage distribution. And we discuss the differences in our result with respect to the approach that I presented you before. So first of all, this is the easiest part even for me. Let me explain you how we identify the power, let's say, power factor. Our point of reference to which we want to compare, to, let's say, to discuss is the RTI indicator. That is a routine task indicator that was developed by author Asiemoglu and many other authors, has been used by many labor economists in order to, as I said to you before, to quantify the degree of repetitiveness and routinarity in occupation. So this RTI indicator is made by the sum of different elements that can be extracted from the ONET survey that I described you before, that essentially tell you how much a job is a routine characterized by high degree of routine manual activity, routine cognitive activity, non-routine manual and non-routine cognitive interpersonal activities, and non-routine cognitive analytical activity. Now it might seem a bit difficult, but the main idea of this indicator used by this labor economist is to distinguish occupations and distinguish the degree of repetitiveness and routinarity, separating a cognitive from manual task, because as we said, the cognitive task might be replaced, whereas manual task might be more difficult to replace by computer, by automated technologies, because of the manual skills of worker. Okay, so this is the main, let's say, indicator that is used to identify this content of labor activity that usually provides as a negative effect on wages. Usually in wage regression, when you put the RTA indicator, you find that the coefficient is statistically significant and negative, implying that workers that perform activities that have high degree of routinarity will have a wage penalty. But then we said, okay, but then maybe we can look at other factors. So we can define occupation, the content of occupation in a different way, departing from the routine, non-routine duality and expanding the analysis. And this is a our, let's say, anatomy power indicator that comes from a previous analysis that we have done in a paper that was published on Industrial and Corporate Change journal in 2020, where our main question was to understand which are the main traits, the main characteristic of the occupations when we expand our point of view. How we identified these, let's say, these attributes of the Italian occupation. Essentially, instead of performing simple a sum of components, as in the case of RTI, we performed a factor analysis on a set of variables that, according to us and according to the literature we were referring to, are crucial to identify occupational characteristics. Which are these variables? These variables that we identified, consider that this type of database, the ICP, also the ONET, has more than 400 questions, so is plenty of data, information, and so on and so forth. So you need to have a specific, let's say, an approach, a theoretical point of departure in order to identify the questions that you want to select. We proceeded with a multi-step procedure, but let's say that we identified 3 main domains of interest. The knowledge domain, we said, okay, it's crucial to understand which type of knowledge is characterizing a specific occupation, and this, if you want, is also a link to the evolutionary perspective, according to which productive organization and the firms are essentially places where knowledge is produced, is distributed, and routines take place. So the idea of knowledge as a crucial attribute of labor process. And we identify knowledge looking at, for instance, the necessity of updating your knowledge, the presence of active learning, selective attention, distributed attention, and so on and so forth. So this is a domain of interest. Then another domain of interest in our cases was to understand the level of use of technology to link our analysis to the routine task theory. So we also selected questions related to the use of computer, the knowledge of ICT, or the simple use of email as tool of work. And then this is the most complex domain of interest, that is the work organization. We said, okay, in order to understand how a labor and activity is performed, we need to understand the working context in which this labor is performed. So we identified as element of the work organization the social context, so the degree of relation with colleagues, the presence of teamwork, the competition among colleagues, the routinarity, of course, intended as repetitive movements and dexterity and automation degree. And 2 elements that, if you want, were the novelty with respect, the main novelty together with the knowledge with respect to the approach that I described before, that is autonomy and control. Autonomy is can take different forms, okay? The autonomy in doing your job can be autonomy in decision making, but can be also autonomy in planning, or autonomy in doing the job, the capability of worker to solve complex problem, to solve unexpected issues. Control can also take different form. Control can be over people, so the level of leadership, the influence that you have on your organization, and in terms of control over the process, so the inspection of the equipment, the identification and control of standards, and so on and so forth. So with all these variables, we then performed a factor analysis. Do you know what a factor analysis does? You can say if you want. No. Okay, don't worry. Anyway, essentially what we do with a factor analysis, we exploit the variance of the variables, and we see if analyzing the variance of the variability of our variable in the entire occupational structure of the Italian economy, we can identify some factors, some combination of variables that are explained by some hidden factor. The idea is to understand which variables are combined because of a similar pattern of variability among the occupational structure. Is it clear? Okay, so this is the result of our factor analysis. Essentially, as you see, we have a combination of the variable presented before, but not following the domain that we classified, in a new way that essentially are all related to a single hidden factor, okay? And then, given the composition of each of these factors, we can label the factor and we can, in some sense, identify which are the attributes of our occupational structure. The factors are presented in order, in hierarchical order, from the one that has the highest variance explained, the one that is more informative about our occupational structure, to the one that has a lowest level of information, variance explained. We will focus only on the first three, but let's see already the spoiler of the label of these factors. The first one, as you see, is a combination of evaluation and evaluation of autonomy and control, essentially. Autonomy and control. So we call this factor power, because it's not simple, the autonomy, but also its control. According to us, this combination is a proxy of hierarchical power. Then the second one is interesting, because here you have a combination of factors that usually are intended as repetitive jobs, like undexterity is one of the main factors used in the RTI literature to identify repetitive manual jobs that are usually very low-skilled jobs. But what we find here, that together with the undexterity, we also find some element of control over the process and autonomy in performing, in solving unexpected issues. So we call this factor cognitive and manual dexterity, with the idea that if you have are performing even a low-skilled job, like in the manufacturing sector, maybe your manual dexterity is also linked to a cognitive dexterity in solving problems that you can face in your everyday activity. Okay, so maybe low-skilled is not the right term to identify this type of jobs. And then the third one is very easy to label, because you see that essentially it replicates the ICT skills, the digital skills domain. We find that ICT knowledge, use of computer and mail use are all grouped together with a knowledge variable that is updated and using. Meaning that, what does this mean? This means that occupations where you have a high intensity of use of computer are also occupations where workers said that they need to update their knowledge, which is quite consistent. If you are exposed to technology, you need to update if you are exposed to technology, yes, you need to update your knowledge, okay? You have to read this variable as intensity given by the worker. Of course, I didn't say this at the beginning. What is interesting with this factor analysis, but I will be very quick on this, is that essentially we can then perform an analysis of the distribution of this factor along the occupational structure. First, let's focus here. Here we look at ISCO groups. You remember I told you, ISCO groups are the macro categories that identified work, labor, let's say ISCO classes. So we move from legislators, managers to elementary occupation. What we can say from this box plot of the distribution of the first factor, power. Here we have legislator, intellectual and scientific workers, and we go down in the structure until we get to the elementary occupation. According to you, what is telling us? This is a measure of the factor. So this is a box plot, you know, it's a synthetic representation of the distribution of the factor within the legislator group, and the same for the other. What is emerging from this graph? Is increasing, is decreasing? Yes? The higher is this one, the higher ISCO. First is legislator, so are the one legislator manager, so the one with the high skilled and high wages. So exactly. So is decreasing over the occupational structure. Okay, no, it's okay because you got confused with the number of the ISCO class. Exactly, so it's decreasing, is higher at the highest, and then it's going down, okay? It's quite consistent. Okay? Then you do the same and look at the occupations. This is a way to verify if your analysis makes sense. And here you see the occupation that record the highest score are indeed general manager, ambassadors, blah, blah, directors, and the one with the lowest score are essentially elementary occupations, domestic workers, and so on and so forth. And you can do the same with the other with the other factor. Let's make also this case of cognitive and manual dexterity. So cognitive and manual dexterity factor is essentially, as you can see, is concentrated mainly in two classes, okay? Because for all the other is mainly negative, meaning that is not characterizing that classes. And which are the classes that record a high score of this cognitive and manual dexterity? Essentially the 6th and the 7th group that are craft, specialized workers, plant and machine operators, and assemblers. Indeed, here we are referring mainly to manufacturing workers, manual workers, that, as we said, need to combine their manual dexterity with a if you want an experience, a knowledge, a learning by doing knowledge that help them to solve issues and unexpected problems. And so on and so forth, we can do the same for all. But what we do in this paper is essentially to combine all the information coming from the 5 factors in one single factor, the anatomy, that will be essentially driven by power, because power is the factor that has the highest variance overall. So it's the one that is most capable to identify and distinguish the occupation, but we also take into account the counterbalancing factor role of the other factors. And so we have our anatomy factor that, if you want to expand, as I said, the discussion, not focusing on routine and non-routine, but introducing element of knowledge, hierarchical power, cognitive and manual dexterity, and we see how our anatomy factor behave with respect to the routine task index. Again, looking at the distribution of ISCO classes from legislator, manager to elementary occupation. What you can see here you have the standardized value of anatomy and RTI. What can you see from this graph? How do they move? RTI and anatomy. Do they follow the same trend? It's quite the opposite, exactly. So we are actually capturing different animals, if you want, okay? So the same, we can also then see how these factors, these attributes of occupation are linked to the wage distribution of our occupations. Okay, here we see what we see are the average wage by RTI percentile and the average wage by anatomy percentile. So what we are doing here, we are taking our RTI indicator, we are taking our anatomy indicator, and we divide it in percentile. Okay, the highest is the value of the indicator, and then we see the average wage. What we see here for the anatomy is very clear. It's very clear. Explicit. The wage is increasing or decreasing over the percent, going up and is increasing. Okay, the highest the indicator, the highest the wage. Whereas in the case of the RTI, we see this wage penalizing effect apart from some discontinuity. Okay, and this is the anatomy indicator. Then we have the care variable. This is much easier to identify the attribute of the care variable, the care of care jobs, because essentially here we can exploit the information provided by one single question of our questionnaire survey that asks to the worker how important is to provide personal assistance, medical attention, emotional support, or personal care to others, colleagues, clients, patients, and workers have to answer, providing an intensity between 0 and 100. How do we distinguish care jobs from all other jobs where you might also provide some emotional support? With a prevalence approach. Essentially, we impose a rule according to which if the intensity of this variable is higher than 60 out of 100, we identify the job as a care job. And then we check, of course, if this criteria to identify care jobs is consistent with the list of jobs that we then observe that then emerge from the analysis. And indeed this is the case, because this very simple criteria of identification is quite good in identifying care jobs. Which are these care jobs? Essentially, they are concentrated in health, which is quite clear, in the education sector, and in social service and other activities like domestic workers, etc. Here we also provide information about the female share, how many women are performing this job and how many men. So this percentage of female worker within an occupation is a measure of gender, segregation. No? So if the number of women is much higher than the majority, then we can say that the job is female segregated, in the sense that the amount of women is higher than the average number of women that you find in other jobs. Okay, and this is usually the case in the care jobs. For most of care jobs, with the exception of which type of jobs in the care sector, where we don't find female segregation? Doctors. And this is then strictly related also to a wage inequality. So, essentially, if we look at the care jobs and we distinguish well-paid care jobs and low-paid care jobs, we see that the care jobs that are well-paid are mainly doctors in the health sector and are mainly performed by male workers. Whereas low-paid care jobs are mainly related to personal care worker, domestic worker, and are mainly performed by female workers. So this means that when we look at care jobs, actually the dimension of care and the dimension of gender cannot be separated. We need to consider them together to really appreciate the level of inequality and gender segregation. And this is also clear if you look at these two graphs that are very simple. Essentially here we look at the average real wage, distinguishing between care jobs and non-care jobs. So you see that when we just distinguish between care and non-care, the wage penalty, there is a difference, a wage penalty, but it's quite limited, it's quite low. But then once within the care job group, we distinguish between female and male. Here, the gap between female care workers and male care workers is even higher than the gap between female workers and male workers. So this really means that there is an interaction between gender segregation and care devaluation that need to be taken into account. So given the construction of our indicator, we can now move to the empirical analysis. As I said, the first part is quite simple. We perform a mean Serian wage equation where we add step by step RTI, anatomy, and then the care job dummy to identify care workers from all the others. Of course, we need to control for a number of factors that could severely affect our wages, like the sector, like individual factors, attributes, age, type of contract, gender, that is of course very important, but also sectors, areas, and year. Okay, so we control for all of these, and then we perform our analysis. So this is the first baseline model, the one of the mean Serian one, and then we have we integrate and we add the other variables. With respect to RTI, what we see that once we move on to the most complete model where we have all the variables, actually the RTI moves from a negative and statistical significant coefficient to a positive statistical significant coefficient, in the sense that this indicator shows a very low level of stability, in the sense that the sign is changing, meaning that probably the negative sign was related to the lack of consideration of other variables that were important. Indeed, instead, the anatomy indicator is always positive and statistically significant. The care job dummy that distinguish workers that do a care job from all the other is negative and statistically significant, whereas the interaction between care and female that according to us was very important, according to what we saw before in the descriptive graph, actually result to be not statistically significant, but negative but not statistically significant. First of all, how we can compare these models, because these are all, let's say, the same empirical model with more variables, but let's say the equation is the same. We can make a fitness analysis where we compare the fitness of each model, and let's say, according to the fitness analysis, the last model is the best one. So in some sense, this is a support to our idea that in order to account for wage inequality, we cannot consider only RTI and all the other factors that are relevant, but we need also to accounting for the hierarchical dimension of labor and the role of care. So this is, let's say, in support of our analysis, expanded analysis of wage determinants. But then there is an issue. Here we are in a linear setting. In some sense, we are neglecting the possibility that the same variable can affect in a different way the wage if we move in on the wage distribution. This we cannot see because here we are in a linear setting. In order to account for this asymmetry, for the possibility that, for instance, doing a care job can have a different impact on the wage if we are at the bottom of the wage distribution or at the top of the wage distribution, we need to move to another empirical setting, that is the quantile regression. Because with the quantile regression, we can compute the coefficient of our variable at each part of the distribution of the wage distribution we are interested at, okay? And this is what we do. This is the table, but let's look at the graphs that are more, let's say, maybe interesting. These are the graphs of the quantile coefficients, okay? So how much they gives us an idea of how the variable of interest are affecting, let's say, are correlated to change in the wage structure, moving from the bottom of the wage distribution to the top of the wage distribution. So in the case of the RTI, that is, let's say, as we said, one of the key factors to understand the wage inequality according to the approach that we defined before, we find again, if you want, this lack of the lack of a stable behavior, in the sense that it moves from a negative value, but then essentially it has almost a null impact because it's around 0. When we move, let's say, we just move from the 20th quantile up. So essentially the impact is, the impact is positive for the very bottom, but then it becomes almost null. So this factor is not able to explain anymore any wage, the determination of wage. Anatomy has a completely different behavior. What we see here for the anatomy, first of all, we see that it's always positive, okay, so it doesn't change, and then here its impact is increasing once we move up in the distribution, in the wage distribution. Then here is the case of care jobs and care jobs interacted with female. What are we looking here at? Care job is a dummy that identifies jobs that are in the care sector from all other jobs. So the coefficient is a measure of the difference. It tells us information about the difference between the wage of a worker with all the same characteristic that is in the care sector from a worker that has the same characteristic is not in the same sector. So when we are looking at dummy, we are looking at comparison between two groups, okay? It's not that we increase by 1 unit the fact that we are doing a care job. It's a change of a status. Here, what do we see? Is there someone that wants to provide an interpretation? Yes? No? Okay, so we see what we see. Here there is 0, okay? So we see that in the first part of the wage distribution, so in the top and median part, in the bottom and median part, so where we have low and medium wage workers, what is the value of the coefficient? Is positive or negative? Is negative, meaning that doing a care job and being at the bottom of the wage distribution has a penalizing effect. Because here we are talking of essential workers in domestic and cleaning, and so on and so forth. But then what happens when we move up around the 75 quantile, when we move from to the up part of the wage distribution, how the coefficient becomes? We are over 0, so it becomes positive. So it means that doing a care jobs when you are, in the top part of distribution, which is a sense because we are looking at doctors. And what happens when we look at the care jobs interacted with female? Here we are looking at the changing at a specific group. We are looking at female worker that perform a care job. We are comparing this with female workers that are not performing a care job and care male workers. What do we see here? The opposite that we saw here. When we are in the bottom of the distribution, the coefficient is positive, meaning that if you are a low-wage worker, the fact that maybe you work in the essential sectors maybe has a positive effect on your wage, in the sense that you earn slightly more than another low-wage worker. So the comparison is among low-wage workers. But then when you go up in the wage distribution, you find the opposite effect, in the sense that in this case, being a female may determine a wage penalty. And how we can explain this dynamic? There are scholars that have studied this dynamic as a social closure mechanism, in the sense that in jobs that are characterized by higher wages, that might be in place some mechanism that indeed allow a persistent gender wage inequality. For instance, in the terms of overtime allowances and other wage premium that can in some sense penalize women because of their reproductive activities and so on, needs and so on and so forth. So here, in some sense, through this quantile analysis, we are able to appreciate two empirical facts that we observe in the economy. Here, the negative penalizing effect for low-income workers of doing a care job, and here, the quite specific and special case of female workers that can face different conditions according to the place they are in terms of, with respect to the wage distribution. So, then, to further corroborate the need of a quantile regression, you can compare the dotted line confidence interval, that is interval estimated through a linear regression, with the interval characterized by the thicker line, that is the interval computed through the quantile regression. As you see, let's say the gap, the difference between the two, confirms the necessity of a quantile regression, because the behavior is quite different. Okay, so this is just to confirm the need of a quantile regression. So to sum up, I'm going to the conclusion. Let's say the findings of our analysis show two main things. Essentially that there are other attributes, let's say, of the labor process that need to be taken into account when we discuss wage inequality and determination of wages, and these two attributes that are crucial and need to be integrated into the analysis are the hierarchical power dimension within the labor process and the role of care. As you saw, they move in the opposite way, in the sense that hierarchical power is always increasing over the wage distribution, so is enhancing the wage inequality, whereas care has a negative penalizing effect with important differences according to the wage distribution that characterize that specific job. So in some sense, these results are consolidating what we find in the economy and what emerged in a very clear and explicit way during the pandemic. In a sense, the pandemic was quite interesting because, and that's why I started with the picture of the pandemic, because it seems to be a moment in which there was a change, a switch, also in the recognition of the value of essential job and essential care activities. But in the end, if we look now at statistics, labor statistics, we see that wages and even working conditions of care workers have even worsened. So this is, let's say, another confirmation of the need, also from an heterodox and a critical perspective, of studies the way through which this extraction of value take place within the labor market. So among different types of occupations like managers and care workers, but also, of course, outside the labor market where value extraction mechanisms also take place in a quite radical way. And that's it. Thank you for the attention.